You ever seen someone stand that still and still look completely out of place? The lieutenant's voice carried across the training yard with a sharp edge of amusement, and the Marines around him responded exactly as expected, a ripple of laughter breaking through the steady rhythm of boots on gravel and commands echoing in the dry afternoon air, because the man standing near the edge of the range did not fit into anything they understood. Not the pace, not the posture, not the uniform that was no longer there. Thomas Hale stood with his hands loosely at his sides, a faded jacket resting lightly over his shoulders, his frame straight but unforced, as if standing still required no effort at all, and he did not turn when the laughter reached him, did not shift his weight or offer any sign that he had even heard it, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the line of movement, beyond the drills and shouted corrections, toward a distance no one else seemed to notice. Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell stepped forward, the gravel crunching under his boots, his posture sharp, his presence confident in the way that came from rank and repetition, and he stopped a few feet in front of Thomas, tilting his head slightly as if examining something out of place. "You lost, old man," he said, the words light, almost casual, but carried by the kind of certainty that did not expect resistance. And the Marines behind him leaned in just enough to watch, their attention shifting from routine to entertainment, because moments like this broke the pattern, gave them something to react to, something to define. Thomas did not answer immediately, not because he had not heard, but because the question itself did not seem to require urgency, and when he finally moved, it was only to glance briefly at the rifle rack beside him, his eyes passing over the equipment not as if he were seeing it for the first time, but as if he were remembering it, measuring it against something older, something internal, and then his gaze returned forward, calm, steady, unbothered. "No," he said simply, his voice low, even, carrying no trace of defense or explanation, and that simplicity hung in the air for a moment longer than the laughter had, because it did not give Mitchell anything to push against. Mitchell let out a short breath through his nose, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Then you might want to move," he added, gesturing lightly toward the boundary line. "This is an active training zone," and his tone shifted just enough to lean into authority now, the humor thinning as the need to reassert control took over, and around them, the Marines straightened slightly, their attention sharpening. Because this was familiar territory again, this was structure, command, the system resetting itself. Thomas did not step back, did not argue, he simply remained where he was, his posture unchanged, his presence quiet but anchored, and the wind moved across the range, carrying the faint scent of dust and metal, lifting the edge of his jacket just enough to reveal nothing of significance, only the impression of something worn, something old, before it settled again, and Mitchell's eyes flicked to it briefly, then back to Thomas, irritation beginning to replace amusement. Because the lack of reaction disrupted the rhythm more than resistance ever could. "You are standing in the wrong place," Mitchell said again, this time firmer, the words clean, direct, and Thomas met his gaze then, not challenging, not yielding, just present, as if the space between them carried no hierarchy, no imbalance, only a moment waiting to be understood, and for a second, something shifted, too subtle to name, too brief to hold, before the sounds of the range pushed back in, commands echoing, boots moving, the structure continuing as if nothing had changed, while beneath it, just beneath the surface, the moment had already begun to take shape in a way none of them yet recognized. The moment did not resolve the way Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell expected it to, and that alone was enough to unsettle him, not visibly, not in a way the Marines behind him would immediately notice, but in the tightening of his jaw, in the slight shift of his stance as he recalibrated what should have been a simple interaction into something that refused to follow the pattern. The range continued around them, commands moving in sharp, practiced bursts, rifles lifting and lowering in rhythm, the sound of controlled fire cutting through the dry air, and yet for Mitchell, the noise seemed to pull back just slightly, as if the focus of the entire space had narrowed to the man standing in front of him, the one who had not moved, had not argued, had not done anything that justified the attention and yet held it anyway. "You do not get to ignore instructions here," Mitchell said, his voice steady, controlled, no longer amused, the tone shifting fully into authority now, and he took a step closer, closing the gap that Thomas Hale had not bothered to acknowledge. "Step outside the line," he added, gesturing again toward the boundary marker painted across the ground, the white line bright against the dust, clear, defined, the kind of line that separated structure from disorder, and for a moment, everything seemed to hinge on whether Thomas would cross it. Thomas glanced down briefly, not at the line itself, but at the ground around it, as if measuring something that had nothing to do with the paint, his eyes tracing the subtle slope of the terrain, the way the wind moved across it, the way the Marines shifted their weight as they stepped through their drills, and then he looked back up, his expression unchanged. "Your line is off," he said quietly, the words landing without emphasis, without challenge, just a statement placed into the space between them, and for a fraction of a second, Mitchell did not respond, not because he had not heard, but because the sentence did not fit into anything he expected. A few of the Marines behind him exchanged quick glances, the earlier laughter gone, replaced by something more cautious, something that hovered between curiosity and disbelief, because this was no longer just an old man out of place, this was something else, something that disrupted the rhythm they trusted. Mitchell exhaled slowly, forcing a short, controlled laugh that did not carry the same confidence as before. "The line is exactly where it is supposed to be," he replied, his voice tightening just slightly, and he turned, signaling to one of the Marines stepping into position. "Run it," he ordered, and the Marine moved forward immediately, following the marked boundary, aligning his stance with the painted edge, his movements precise, trained, and when he executed the drill, the result was solid, consistent, nothing visibly wrong, and Mitchell turned back with a look that suggested confirmation, as if the system had just proven itself. Thomas did not argue, did not point out anything further, he simply watched, his eyes following the motion not as an observer, but as someone comparing it against something internal, something unseen, and when the Marine reset for another pass, Thomas spoke again, just as quietly, "Half a foot back," he said, and the Marine hesitated, just for a moment, his eyes flicking to Mitchell for approval, uncertainty breaking through discipline for a fraction of a second, and Mitchell held his gaze, the pause stretching longer than it should have, before he gave a short nod, almost dismissive. "Do it," he said, and the Marine adjusted, shifting his stance slightly behind the line, realigning his footing, and when he ran the drill again, the movement flowed cleaner, smoother, the timing sharper in a way that did not need explanation. The difference was subtle, but it was there, and this time, no one laughed, not even Mitchell, who stood still, watching the result settle into place. The certainty he had relied on moments ago now carrying a faint crack, not enough to break, not yet, but enough to make him aware of it, and across from him, Thomas Hale remained exactly as he had been, calm, steady, as if the correction had not been an act, but a simple acknowledgement of something that had always been there, waiting to be seen. The shift did not disappear after the second correction, it settled instead, deeper, quieter, threading itself into the rhythm of the range in a way that could not be undone, and Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell felt it every time another Marine stepped forward, every time a stance was taken, every time a shot landed just slightly off from where it should have been, because now there was something else in the air, something unspoken that made each movement feel as though it was being measured against a standard no one had defined. "Stay focused," Mitchell called out, his voice firm, sharper than before, pulling the line back into order, and the Marines responded immediately, their discipline holding, their movements snapping into alignment, but the ease that had been there earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet awareness that lingered at the edges of every action. Thomas Hale had not moved from his position, had not stepped closer or further away, and yet his presence felt more central now than it had when he first arrived, his eyes moving slowly across the range, not following individuals, but patterns, timing, spacing, as if the entire exercise was something he had seen unfold before, something he understood without needing to participate in it, and that was what drew attention again, not what he did, but how he saw. A Marine midway down the line struggled to maintain consistency, his shots drifting slightly, his posture tightening with each attempt, frustration building in the small adjustments he made, and Mitchell stepped toward him, ready to correct, his voice already forming the instruction, but before he could speak, Thomas's voice carried across the space again, calm, even. "You are rushing the breath," he said, and the words landed with the same quiet precision as before, not interrupting, not demanding, simply present, and the Marine froze for a fraction of a second, his eyes flicking to Mitchell, waiting, because now there was a choice, not between right and wrong, but between two sources of authority, one defined, one unexplained. Mitchell held the moment longer than he should his gaze fixed on the Marine, then shifting briefly toward Thomas, the tension tightening in his chest as he weighed something he could not fully articulate, and then he gave a short nod, almost imperceptible. "Slow it down," he said, echoing the instruction in his own words, and the Marine adjusted, his breathing steadier, his posture loosening just enough to settle, and when he fired again, the result held, consistent, controlled, and this time, the improvement was not subtle, it was clear enough that several Marines along the line paused just a fraction longer than necessary, their attention drifting toward Thomas despite themselves. The silence that followed was different now, not empty, not uncertain, but heavy with recognition that had not yet been accepted, and Mitchell felt it press against him, not as a challenge, but as a question he could not answer. Because the man standing just beyond his line was not behaving like someone who needed to prove anything, and that absence of effort made everything else feel more deliberate, more precise, more difficult to dismiss. Mitchell straightened, his posture tightening again as he turned back toward the line, reasserting control with a sharper command. "Next," he called, his voice cutting cleanly through the air, and the Marines moved, the drill continuing, the structure holding, but beneath it, the shift remained, growing quieter, deeper, and at the center of it stood Thomas Hale, unchanged, unhurried. As if the moment unfolding around him was not something new, but something returning, something that had already happened once before, waiting now to be recognized again. The range no longer sounded the same, even though nothing in the commands had changed, even though the rhythm of training continued exactly as it should, because beneath the structure, something quieter had taken hold, something that did not belong to orders or repetition, and Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell felt it pressing in from every direction, not loud enough to disrupt, but steady enough that it could not be ignored. He moved down the line again, correcting a shoulder here, a grip there, his voice controlled, precise, each instruction delivered with the same authority he had carried from the beginning, but now there was a second layer beneath it, something tighter, something more deliberate, as if every word needed to reassert its place in a space that had begun to shift without his permission. Thomas Hale remained where he stood, just outside the defined boundary, his posture unchanged, his presence no longer dismissed but not yet understood, and his eyes moved once more across the range, following the Marines not individually, but as a whole, as if he were tracking something larger than the drill itself, something that connected each movement into a pattern only he seemed to recognize. A Marine near the far end of the line hesitated during his transition, his timing slightly off, not enough to fail the drill, but enough to break its flow, and Mitchell saw it immediately. Stepping forward with the intention to correct, his words forming before he reached the position. But again, before he could speak, Thomas's voice carried across the space, calm, steady. "You are anticipating the movement," he said, and the Marine froze for a fraction of a second, the words settling into him before he fully understood them, and he glanced toward Mitchell, waiting, because now the pattern had repeated too many times to ignore. Mitchell stopped, the distance between him and the Marine closing slower than before, his gaze shifting briefly toward Thomas, then back to the Marine. And the pause stretched just long enough to be noticed, just long enough to break the automatic flow of command, before Mitchell gave a short nod. "Hold it," he said, reinforcing the correction without acknowledging its source, and the Marine adjusted, his posture loosening slightly, his timing resetting, and when he moved again, the transition smoothed out, the drill aligning more cleanly than before. This time, no one looked away, no one pretended it was coincidence, the attention held, quiet, focused, and Mitchell felt it settle into him with a weight that was no longer irritation, no longer dismissal, but something more complex, something that forced him to confront the fact that the man standing just beyond his line was not interfering, was not guessing, he was seeing something that others were missing. Mitchell straightened, his shoulders tightening as he turned back toward Thomas, the distance between them now feeling smaller than it had been at the start, not physically, but in the way the space carried meaning, and he took a step forward, his voice lower now, controlled, but stripped of the earlier amusement. "You keep doing that," he said, not a question, not quite an accusation, but something in between, and Thomas met his gaze without hesitation, the same calm, steady presence. "You keep missing it," he replied, just as evenly, and the words landed without force, without challenge, but they did not move, they stayed, settling into the space between them in a way that could not be pushed aside. For a moment, the entire range seemed to hold, the sound of movement continuing in the background, but the focus narrowing again, the pattern tightening. And Mitchell felt the shift fully now, not something external, but something internal, a fracture in certainty that did not break loudly, but quietly, steadily, and around them, the Marines who had once laughed now stood with a different kind of attention, not directed by command, but drawn by something they did not yet understand, while Thomas Hale remained exactly as he had been, unchanged, unbothered, as if the moment unfolding around him was not new, but inevitable, something that had been waiting, patiently, for someone to finally see it. The tension no longer belonged to a single moment, it had settled into the space itself, shaping the way every Marine stood, the way every command was heard, and Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell felt it in the way his own voice sounded when he spoke, still firm, still controlled, but carrying something beneath it now, something that did not come from authority alone, and he moved again along the line, correcting, guiding, reinforcing the structure that had always worked, yet each correction now felt like it was being measured against something quieter, something more precise. Thomas Hale remained where he had been, just outside the boundary, his presence no longer questioned but not yet understood, and as the wind shifted across the range, lifting dust in soft, uneven patterns, his gaze followed it briefly, then returned to the Marines, not with intensity, not with focus on any one individual, but with a kind of awareness that seemed to hold the entire field at once. A sudden misalignment broke the rhythm, a Marine stepping slightly out of sync with the group, his movement half a beat early, enough to disrupt the flow without drawing immediate correction, and Mitchell saw it, his attention snapping toward the error, his instinct ready to step in, but before he moved, Thomas spoke again, softer this time, almost as if the words were meant for the moment rather than the man. "He is hearing the command too late," he said, and the phrasing was different, not about posture, not about stance, but about timing, about perception, and it landed in a way that caused the Marine to pause, his eyes flicking toward Mitchell, uncertain, waiting. Mitchell held still, the seconds stretching longer than they should have, because the statement did not fit into the framework he had been trained to apply, and yet it explained something he had noticed but not named, and after a brief pause, he nodded once. "Reset," he ordered, his voice steady, allowing the Marine to try again, and this time, the movement aligned, the timing sharper, the flow restored, and the difference was not subtle. It was clear enough that several Marines along the line adjusted their own attention, their focus shifting inward, more deliberate, more aware. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was heavy with acknowledgement that no one had spoken aloud, and Mitchell felt it fully now, not as a challenge to his authority, but as a quiet pressure that forced him to reconsider what authority actually meant in this moment, because the man standing beyond his line was not correcting them through rank, not guiding them through command, but through something else entirely, something that did not need to be announced to be real. Mitchell turned slowly, his gaze settling on Thomas again, and this time there was no trace of amusement left, no dismissal, only a measured, controlled scrutiny, as if he were trying to place the man within a system that did not have a space for him, and failing, because nothing about this fit into the categories he understood. "You have done this before," Mitchell said finally, not as a question, but as an attempt to anchor the situation in something definable, and Thomas met his gaze with the same calm steadiness, his expression unchanged. "Not like this," he replied, and the words carried a weight that extended beyond the range, beyond the drills, hinting at something older, something that did not belong to this place or this time, and for a moment, the distance between them felt less like a boundary and more like a line waiting to be crossed by understanding rather than movement, while around them, the Marines stood in quiet alignment, no longer watching for entertainment, no longer waiting for resolution, but holding the moment as it unfolded, aware now that whatever this was, it was no longer something that could be dismissed as coincidence, and that realization settled across the field just as the distant sound of approaching vehicles began to rise, low and steady, carrying with it the sense that the moment was about to shift again in a way none of them could control. The sound reached them before the sight did, a low, steady hum rolling across the range like distant thunder, and every Marine felt it in the same way, not as distraction, but as signal, posture tightening instinctively, movements sharpening without command, because arrivals like this did not need to be announced, they were recognized. Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell heard it and straightened immediately, the shift in his stance automatic. His earlier tension redirected into structure, into readiness. His eyes moving toward the access road beyond the training field where the vehicles would appear, and for the first time since the moment began, his focus pulled away from Thomas Hale, if only for a second, because this was something he understood, something that followed rules he trusted. The Marines along the line adjusted in quiet synchronization, rifles lowered to rest positions, boots aligning, voices fading, the rhythm of the drill dissolving into a controlled stillness that carried more weight than motion ever could, and Staff Sergeant Leo Grant stepped forward slightly, his posture locking into place, his gaze fixed toward the approaching sound. His earlier suspicion now sharpened into something closer to certainty, because timing like this did not happen by accident. The convoy came into view slowly, dark vehicles moving with measured precision, tires crunching against gravel as they approached the edge of the range, and the air itself seemed to narrow, every movement on the field aligning around that single point, every Marine aware, every detail sharper, clearer, as if the moment demanded it. Thomas Hale did not turn, did not adjust, he remained exactly where he had been, his gaze still directed across the range, his posture unchanged, as if the approaching presence did not alter anything for him, and that stillness stood in quiet contrast to everything else, to the tightening formations, the subtle corrections, the shift in attention that pulled the entire field toward the arriving command. Mitchell noticed it, even as he stood aligned, his eyes flicking once more toward Thomas, the contrast settling deeper now, because everyone else had reacted, everyone else had adjusted, and yet the man he had tried to remove from the line remained unaffected, not out of defiance, but out of something else entirely, something that did not respond to rank the same way, and that realization pressed against him in a way he could not ignore. The vehicles came to a stop, doors opening in sequence. Officers stepping out with controlled movements, their presence immediate, undeniable, and the Marines held their positions, the silence now complete, not empty, but full, carrying expectation that had not yet been spoken, and Grant felt it settle into place, his instincts confirming what his mind had only begun to form, that whatever this moment was becoming, it had already moved beyond the range, beyond the drill, into something that would not be contained by routine. The final door opened, and the figure that stepped out did so without haste, his presence shifting the atmosphere at the moment. His boots touched the ground, not through volume, not through command, but through recognition that moved ahead of him, and though he had not yet spoken, had not yet changed direction, the path was already forming, subtle but clear, drawing toward the edge of the range where Thomas Hale stood, unchanged, unbothered, as if the moment now unfolding had been expected long before the engines had ever been heard, while the wind moved across the field once more, carrying with it the quiet certainty that what came next would not need to be explained to be understood. The silence did not break when the figure stepped forward, it deepened, settling across the range with a weight that no command could replicate, and every Marine felt it without needing to be told, their posture locking tighter, their focus narrowing, because presence like this did not demand attention, it drew it. General Andrew Collins moved across the gravel with measured steps, his pace unhurried, each movement deliberate in a way that carried its own authority, and Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell stood at attention as he approached, the earlier tension within him redirected now into discipline, into form, his voice steady as he reported, "Sir," the word clean, precise, exactly as it should be, and Collins gave a slight nod, acknowledging without slowing, his gaze already moving beyond Mitchell, scanning the line, the formation, the field itself, not quickly, not searching, but observing in a way that suggested he was not looking for anything new, only confirming what he already knew. Staff Sergeant Leo Grant stood rigid, his eyes forward, but his awareness sharpened, tracking the general's movement with a precision born of instinct rather than instruction, because there was something in the way Collins walked, something in the direction his attention held, that did not align with a routine inspection. The Marines held their positions, the range now completely still, the earlier rhythm replaced by a silence that carried expectation, and Mitchell followed the general's line of sight without meaning to, his focus shifting just slightly to the right, toward the edge of the boundary, toward the place he had tried to clear earlier, and the realization settled into him slowly, not as a thought, but as a feeling, that the moment he had tried to control had moved beyond him entirely. Thomas Hale had not moved, not even now, as the highest authority on the field approached, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady, as if the presence drawing closer did not alter his position in the slightest, and that stillness stood in quiet contrast to everything else, to the tightened formations, the controlled breathing, the sharpened awareness that filled the space. Collins slowed as he neared the center of the line, his steps shortening slightly, his attention narrowing, and for a brief moment, he paused, not fully stopping, but enough that the movement of the field seemed to hinge on it, and Mitchell felt it, the shift, the subtle change in pace that carried more meaning than any spoken command, because it did not follow protocol, it followed recognition. Collins resumed his movement, but now the direction was clear, unmistakable, angled toward the boundary line, toward the man who had remained outside of it, and Grant's suspicion settled into certainty, his mind connecting what his instincts had already understood, while Mitchell felt something else take hold, something quieter, heavier, the first real fracture in the certainty he had carried since the beginning. The distance closed slowly, each step deliberate, each moment stretching just enough to allow the weight of it to settle across everyone present, and as Collins came within a few feet of Thomas Hale, he stopped fully this time, the motion complete, the silence absolute, and for a brief second, nothing happened, no words, no gestures. Only the stillness of two men standing across from each other, one defined by rank, the other by something that had not yet been spoken, and in that pause, the entire range seemed to hold its breath, because whatever came next would not be a continuation of what had been, it would be something else entirely, something that would redefine the moment in a way none of them could ignore. The silence did not break immediately, it stretched, holding every Marine in place, holding every breath just a fraction longer than normal, and General Andrew Collins stood facing Thomas Hale without speaking, his eyes fixed not on the uniform that was no longer there, not on the man's age or posture, but on something deeper, something that did not belong to the present moment, and for a second that felt longer than it should have. Nothing moved. Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell felt it press against him, the weight of that silence, the way it carried meaning without a single word, and he stood rigid, his gaze forward but his awareness pulled toward the edge of the line, toward the two figures whose stillness had begun to redefine everything around them. Collins took a slow breath, subtle, controlled, and then his eyes shifted slightly, narrowing just enough as if something had aligned in his memory, something that had been distant now coming into focus, and he spoke, but not loudly, not with command, his voice lower than expected, measured, almost careful. "Your name," he said, not as a demand, not as a challenge, but as a request shaped by recognition that had not yet fully surfaced. Thomas Hale did not hesitate, did not look away. "Hale," he answered, the word simple, steady, carrying no weight in the way it was delivered, and for a brief moment, nothing changed, the name settling into the air without reaction, without acknowledgement, as if it had not yet reached the place it needed to. Collins remained still, his expression unchanged, but something shifted behind his eyes, something subtle, almost imperceptible, and then he repeated it, quieter, as if testing it against memory. "Hale," the single word hanging between them, and this time, the pause that followed was different, heavier, stretching deeper, as if the name had begun to open something that had been closed for a long time. The wind moved across the range again, lifting dust in soft waves, brushing against uniforms, against the edges of the line, and Collins turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough to break the direct alignment, his gaze drifting past Thomas for a fraction of a second before returning, and when he spoke again, the change was unmistakable, not in volume, not in tone, but in certainty. "Thomas Hale," he said, the full name landing with quiet precision, and the moment it left his lips, the air itself seemed to shift, the silence tightening, becoming something else entirely. Mitchell felt it before he understood it, the sudden weight that settled across the range, the way every Marine remained perfectly still, not by command, but by instinct, because something had just been recognized that did not need explanation, and Grant's posture did not change, but his eyes sharpened, the final confirmation locking into place. Collins did not move immediately after speaking the name, he held the moment, his gaze steady on Thomas, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, his posture adjusted, not into formality, not into command, but into something quieter, something that carried respect without announcing it, and Thomas Hale remained as he had been, unchanged, his expression calm, his presence steady, as if the name that had just altered the entire field was simply his, nothing more, nothing less, and around them, the Marines who had once laughed now stood in absolute silence, the shift complete, the moment no longer uncertain, no longer unfolding, but fully realized in a way that needed no further words to be understood. No one spoke after the name was said, because nothing needed to be added to it, nothing could improve it, and General Andrew Collins stood there for a moment longer, his gaze steady on Thomas Hale as if confirming something that had already been decided long ago, and then, without urgency, without announcement, he shifted his stance slightly, turning just enough so that he stood not across from Thomas, but beside him. The movement subtle, almost unnoticeable, yet it carried more weight than any formal gesture could have. Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell felt it immediately, the shift in position, the quiet alignment that changed everything without a single command being given, and the certainty he had held on to since the beginning dissolved completely, not shattered, not broken, but replaced by an understanding that arrived without explanation, without instruction, and he remained at attention. But the meaning of that posture had changed, no longer just obedience, but recognition. The Marines along the line did not move, did not speak, their earlier reactions gone entirely, replaced by a stillness that held respect in its silence, because they had seen the moment unfold, had felt it take shape, and even without knowing the full history, they understood enough to know that something had been revealed that could not be undone. Staff Sergeant Leo Grant lowered his gaze just slightly, not out of uncertainty, but out of acknowledgement, the final piece settling into place, and the range itself seemed different now, the same ground, the same lines, the same drills waiting to continue, but carrying a new weight, a quiet gravity that lingered in the air. Mitchell finally allowed his eyes to shift, just for a second, toward Thomas Hale, and the image he saw was not the same one he had first dismissed, not the out-of-place figure standing beyond the boundary, but something else entirely, something that had been there from the beginning, hidden not because it needed to be, but because it did not need to be seen until now. And he straightened slightly, the adjustment small but deliberate, a silent correction of his own. Collins did not speak further, did not explain, did not recount anything from the past, because the name had already done that, had carried everything it needed within it, and after a moment, he gave a brief nod, not formal, not ceremonial, just enough to mark the moment as complete, and then his attention shifted back toward the range, toward the Marines who stood waiting, their formation still intact, their focus sharpened by what they had just witnessed. The wind moved again, softer now, brushing across the field, lifting the edge of Thomas's jacket before letting it fall back into place, and he remained as he had been from the start, calm, steady, unchanged by the recognition that had just altered everything around him, as if the respect now filling the space was not something gained, but something that had always been there, waiting quietly. And as the range prepared to move again, as commands would soon resume and the rhythm would return, one thing remained clear in the silence that lingered just a moment longer, that respect was never created in that instant. It had only been revealed, because some names are not spoken to be known, they are spoken because they were never forgotten.